So you're an ENFJ and now you can't wait to read everything that's ever been written about us. Me too, which is why I decided to go through the books on my shelf and find out all the things that all the different authors have written about ENFJs or the extroverted feeling function. In case we haven't met yet, my name's Doris. I'm a type and relationship coach, and I have ENFJ preferences as well. So starting at the beginning, Psychological Types by Carl Jung himself in chapter 10, where he goes into the general description of the types. He writes a few pages about feeling and extroverted feeling, and I'm just going to read these and then give you my reaction in real time where I feel like maybe the descriptions resonate or not. So feeling in the extroverted attitude is likewise oriented by objective data, the object being the indispensable determinant of the quality of the feeling. Right? Object meaning the thing outside us and subject meaning us. The extrovert's feeling is always in harmony with objective values. For anyone who has known feeling only as something subjective, the nature of extroverted feeling will be difficult to grasp because it has detached itself as much as possible from the subjective factor and subordinated itself entirely to the influence of the object. Yes, so if you're new to Jungian ways of describing things, he's quite dense. What he means here, the subjective factor is your own opinion, and the objective factor is what is appropriate in the societal and cultural sense. So we've detached our valuing judgment, our feeling judgment, as much as possible from our own view. So it's definitely the outside holds a bigger influence on how we feel about things. We don't know how we feel about things until we know how other people feel about things. Even when it appears not to be qualified by a concrete object, it is still under the spell of traditional or generally accepted values. So it's the cultural appropriateness or morality. I may feel moved, for instance, to say that something is beautiful or good, not because I find it beautiful or good from my own subjective feeling about it, but because it's fitting and politic to call it so. The contrary judgment would upset the general feeling. So keeping the harmony, keeping the peace. A feeling judgment of this kind is not by any means a pretense or a lie. It is simply an act of adjustment. A painting, for instance, is called beautiful because a painting hung in a drawing room and bearing a well-known signature is generally assumed to be beautiful, or because to call it hideous would offend the family of its fortunate possessor, or because the visitor wants to create a pleasant atmosphere, for which purpose everything must be felt as agreeable. These feelings are governed by an objective criterion. As such, they are genuine and represent the feeling function as a whole. It really illustrates how extroverted feeling can be misunderstood as phony when people cop on to the fact that sometimes we say things in order to keep the peace or be agreeable. We go along to get along kind of thing. Yet that is not meant as a deception or intended to be false, and it doesn't feel like a lie to us because that's how our brain works. Our brain will make us say the thing even though we may not 100% agree with it, but the overarching goal is, well, let's make sure everybody's happy and calm. Sometimes we say things that maybe upon further reflection we don't actually mean or can't really back up or stand behind. But in the moment, it served the purpose of the extroverted feeling function, which is connecting, harmonizing, and getting along. In precisely the same way as extroverted thinking strives to rid itself of subjective influences, extroverted feeling has to undergo a process of differentiation before it is finally denuded of every subjective trimming. The valuations resulting from the act of feeling either correspond directly with objective values or accord with traditional and generally accepted standards. We are a product of our environments, and extroverted feeling types learn very quickly what is acceptable and what isn't. And then we go along with it. This kind of feeling is very largely responsible for the fact that so many people flock to the theater or to concerts or go to church and do so moreover with their feelings correctly adjusted. Okay. Fashions too owe their whole existence to it, and what is far more valuable, the positive support of social, philanthropic, and other cultural institutions. I don't know if we're such a patron of the arts. I thought that was more an extroverted sensation kind of domain, but okay. He knows what he's writing about. Fashion owes their whole existence to it. the positive support of social, philanthropic, and other cultural institutions. So, okay, so social and philanthropic institutions I can see, because the extroverted feeling type is like the bleeding heart of humanity. We want everybody to be safe, sound, happy, and healthy. So, yeah, I can see that the idealistic nature of especially intuition feeling types can lead people to wanting to make society a better place, and then organizing and rallying around it. Having those missions can be an intuiting feeling domain. Extroverted feeling proves itself a creative factor. Without it, a harmonious social life would be impossible. So it's the shepherds of the world trying to keep the peace. To that extent, extroverted feeling is just as beneficial and sweetly reasonable in its effects as extroverted thinking. Oh, can we tell the extroverted thinking types that? That'd be great. But these salutary effects are lost as soon as the object gains ascendancy. What does that mean? The force of extroverted feeling then pulls the personality into the object. The object assimilates him, whereupon the personal quality of the feeling which constitutes its chief charm disappears. It becomes cold, unfeeling, and untrustworthy. I'm not sure what he means by that, except the image that came to mind is we're watching Handmaid's Tale now. If you've read the novel or watched the TV show, it's about this hyper authoritarian, supposedly religious state that forms in the former US of A. The people in charge believe they're leading in the best interest of all involved, although they know that it's not the best for all of them. So I don't know, but I think what Jung is getting at here is sometimes you can fall into this very rigid following of societal norms, where then it becomes actually cold, or the feeling function then actually becomes, you can't trust it anymore because you're just blindly following orders. It has ulterior motives, or at least makes an impartial observer suspect them. Maybe that's going back to what I said earlier, sometimes, paying a compliment and then having to admit that we weren't 100% sincere. That can be perceived as manipulation, even though it may not have started out as willful, intentional manipulation, but I can definitely see how it can come across like that. It no longer makes that agreeable and refreshing impression which invariably accompanies genuine feeling. Instead, one suspects a pose, or that the person is acting, even though it may be quite unconscious of the egocentric motive. What I waffled, he says in one concise sentence. Lovely. Over-extroverted feeling may satisfy aesthetic expectations, but it does not speak to the heart. It appears merely to the senses, or worse still, only to reason. It can provide the aesthetic padding for a situation, but there it stops, and beyond that, its effect is nil. It has become sterile. If this process goes any further, a curiously contradictory dissociation of feeling results. Everything becomes an object of feeling valuations, and innumerable relationships are entered into which are all at variance with each other. That is also interesting. I think the resonance that I see here is for extroverted feeling types who have broad groups of friends and acquaintances that don't necessarily all get along or even fit under a similar umbrella. But there is an interest of the extroverted feeling type to connect with everyone. I don't know if I would call that sterile though. Curiously contradictory dissociation of feeling. I guess if you're trying to please everyone, everything becomes an object of evaluations. In innumerable relationships, that piece just, rang the little bell of, well, yeah, maybe you're a little, not a butterfly, but you're kind of everywhere, half a foot in all, or lots of pies. As this situation would become quite impossible if the subject received anything like due emphasis, even the last vestiges of a real personal standpoint are suppressed. The subject becomes so enmeshed in the network of individual feeling processes that to the observer it seems as though they were merely a feeling process and no longer a subject of feeling. Feeling in this state has lost all human warmth. It gives the impression of being fickle, unreliable, and in the worst case, hysterical. So what that brings to mind is the boggart. If you're familiar with the Harry Potter series, there is a creature that takes on the form of your greatest fear. I think what he's talking about in terms of the feeling function is sometimes We don't know who we are by ourselves. We're like the roosters that used to be on top of the building, and you just go with whoever you're with. That's what you decide to be as well. So I think that's what he's referring to. Now we're going into the extroverted feeling type. If that particular cognitive function is dominant, if the behaviors that result from these cognitive processes become habitual, then we can talk about a feeling type, extroverted feeling type. ENFJ and ESFJ would be extroverted feeling types. He says, as feeling is undeniably a more obvious characteristic of feminine psychology than thinking, the most pronounced feeling types are to be found among women. We're going to take this with a grain of salt because we're trying to not ignore the duality of the time and the values that were apparent when he was writing this over 100 years ago. And I'm also going to say there is no wrong way to have extroverted feeling preferences, and people of all genders and gender expressions can be dominant extroverted feeling types. When extroverted feeling predominates, we speak of an extroverted feeling type. Examples of this type that I can call to mind are, almost without exception, women. The woman of this type follows her feeling as a guide throughout life. As a result of upbringing, her feeling has developed into an adjusted function subject to conscious control. Except in extreme cases, her feeling has a personal quality, even though she may have repressed the subjective factor to a large extent. So he mentioned this before, the general extroverted attitude where the psychic energy or the libido goes to the outside more than the inside. Ideally, there is a balance, but the extroverted attitude and the preference for extroversion means that we go outside first and that we trust the outside a little more than what is happening on the inside. So we may repress that subjective internal factor to a point. He says to a large extent. I would argue that the older we get with this individuation process as well, ideally the more balanced that psyche becomes with the extroversion and introversion. Her personality appears adjusted in relation to external conditions, right? We're orienting ourselves to what's around us. Her feelings harmonize with objective situations and general values. Yep, this is seen nowhere more clearly than in her love choice. The suitable man is loved and no one else. He is suitable not because he appeals to her hidden subjective nature, about which she usually knows nothing, but because he comes up to all reasonable expectations in the matter of age, position, income, size, and respectability of his family, etc. Now, since I have some experience in coaching individuals and couples through their relationship stuff as well, and knowing who I used to be in relationships with and who I ended up marrying, there is a part of me that is going to say, kind of. In the beginning, I think, as a younger ENFJ, I was attracted to not the right person and not the suitable person. And they were appealing not so much to my hidden subjective nature, about which I didn't know a lot, fair to say, but they were interesting in other ways because they were different, or because they were confident, or because I thought I might be able to change them. This age, position, income, respectability of the family, I don't think that factored into a lot of it. And I think what we know nowadays from psychology, that proximity makes a big difference in terms of who we become attracted to and who we end up in relationship with. There's a reason why a lot of relationships start at work or at uni. Think about friendships. The people you tend to spend a lot of time with become more dear to you. We even see this in presidential elections, right? There were studies from many decades ago that if you saw that person's face on a television, you were more likely to find them trustworthy, vote for them. Anyway, tangent. One could easily reject such a picture as ironical or cynical, but I'm fully convinced that the love feeling of this type of woman is in perfect accord with her choice. It is genuine and not just shrewd. There are countless reasonable marriages of this kind, and they are by no means the worst. These women are good companions and excellent mothers, so long as the husbands and children are blessed with the conventional psychic constitution. Okay, so I guess he's making a point of entering into a marriage, which again 100 years ago was a different situation. Divorces were very rare. Nowadays we know that whatever relationship we enter into, we could probably get out of as well, especially if we have our own income, which women in his time didn't have a lot of options or a lot of economic independence. So reasonable marriages, actually I think it is a point that still holds true today, because of the coaching that I've been doing, training that I've been receiving, and learning about other relationships and talking to people. The initial attraction phase, like, we know that fizzles out, right? So a reasonable marriage does not have to be a boring marriage. A reasonable marriage does not have to be settling for something that you don't really like, or someone that you don't think you'll be happy with them or interested in them over a long time. But I think the romantic ideals of finding the one that sweeps you off your feet, where there's thunder, lightning, big storm, I think that's been overvalued as well and overplayed, and there's definitely a move towards a more reasonable relationship approach, which I think is great. And it all starts with self-awareness. And I'm going off on tangents, so you can tell this is not scripted. I'm reading, I'm reacting. Here we go. But one can feel correctly only when feeling is not disturbed by anything else. Nothing disturbs feeling so much as thinking. It is therefore understandable that in this type, thinking will be kept in abeyance as much as possible. This does not mean that the woman does not think at all. On the contrary, she may think a great deal and very cleverly, but her thinking is never sui generis. It is an Epimethean appendage to her feeling. The point he makes is speaking to his model of the psyche and his theory of the tension of opposites of type, where you have those four functions: thinking, feeling, sensing, and intuiting. If you're thinking of them as four cars coming to a crossroads, the four functions can't all go at once or they would crash, right? It is going to be one after the other. And feeling is the opposite of thinking, and sensation is the opposite of intuition. So you can't do both at the same time. And by default, if you practice one more and more, you're going to develop those skills. And if you practice the opposite less and less, then obviously you're not going to be as skilled as using it. And I think that's what he was playing at. What she cannot feel, she cannot consciously think. This is interesting to me because in my personal experience, I feel like I'm thinking about my feelings a lot, and I'm analyzing my feelings and emotions a lot. So this not thinking at all, actually no, he says she may think a great deal, but it is an appendage to her feelings. So yeah, I'm thinking about my feelings, and I'm thinking about other people's feelings, and I'm empathizing with other people's feelings, and I'm imagining what other people are feeling. So it doesn't feel like just a willy-nilly dissolving in a goo of emotions, right? But I can't think what I don't feel, such a type said to me once in indignant tones. So far as her feeling allows, she can think very well, but every conclusion, however logical, that might lead to a disturbance of feeling is rejected on the outset. It is simply not thought. Thus, everything that fits in with objective values is good and is loved, and everything else seems to her to exist in a world apart. That resonates in terms of, I might recognize something as purely logical, categorizing or alphabetizing. I'm looking at my bookshelf, like even putting books on in alphabetically so that you can find them quickly when you're looking for one might make sense. But I organize them by topic and then by color because I want them to look nice and I know where they are. The logic makes sense and that's fine, but it's not the most important thing to me. Does that make sense? I can totally understand why some people would do it. It's just not for me. But a change comes over the picture when the importance of the object reaches a still higher level. As already explained, the subject then becomes so assimilated to the object that the subject of feeling is completely engulfed. Feeling loses its personal quality and becomes feeling for its own sake. The personality seems wholly dissolved in the feeling of the moment. But since actual life is a constant succession of situations that evoke different and even contradictory feelings, the personality gets split up into as many different feeling states. I think that's what we mentioned before with all the different people, that Bogart situation, all the different people, and then you're just reacting to everyone else without actually centering yourself. What's my starting point? At one moment, one is this, at another, something quite different to all appearances, for in reality, such a multiple personality is impossible. The basis of the ego always remains the same and consequently finds itself at odds with the changing feeling states. To the observer, the display of feeling no longer appears as a personal expression of the subject, of the person, but as an alteration of the ego, a mood, in other words. Depending on the degree of dissociation between the ego and the momentary state of feeling, signs of self-disunity will become clearly apparent because the originally compensatory attitude of the unconscious has turned into open opposition. Okay, this is getting very dense and theoretical, but when you are in the presence of someone that just agrees with everyone, even though they may have contradictory opinions, you wonder, are you saying yes to me today and yes to my opponent tomorrow? Maybe you changed your mind, or this morning you slept better and tomorrow you're feeling bad? Or why is it the mood, as in a fleeting, passing moment, right? A feeling judgment, when it is considered and thought through and based in values, feels like it's slowed down, it is solid, it feels tangible, whereas, oh yes this and oh yes that, that's a passing mood, a flight of fancy. And I remember as a younger person being able to identify with a lot of things, and still when I read something I was like, oh yeah, I can see that, I can resonate, or even what I'm doing now, like, yeah, it makes sense, and I can find examples to support the argument, right? Yeah, I have experiences of feeling very scattered in my own mind because I could see everybody else's point of view and not knowing what my own point of view was. It's understanding everyone else's point of view and being able to empathize with them. And that is a strength I think that extroverted feeling types have. And if we don't develop our own perception or our own basis for these opinions, arguments, or our own position, which is usually done with the auxiliary perception function, right, with introverted sensing or introverted intuition, it will come across as scattered. We might be viewed as flaky and all over the place, and we will feel scattered and fragmented as well. This shows itself first of all in extravagant displays of feeling, talk, loud expostulations, etc., which ring hollow. The lady doth protest too much. It is at once apparent that some kind of resistance is being overcompensated, and one begins to wonder whether these demonstrations might not turn out quite different. And a little later they do. Only a very slight alteration in the situation is needed to call forth just the opposite pronouncement of the self-same object. A memory just popped into my head where in high school, in between lessons, I would walk up and down the courtyard with a couple of friends. One of them actually said to me, "You change your mind every 5 minutes," because every break I would have a different opinion. Okay. Only a very slight alteration in the situation is needed to call forth at once just the opposite pronouncement of the self-same object. As a result of these experiences, the observer is unable to take their pronouncement seriously. Yep. He begins to reserve judgment. Since for this type it is of the highest importance to establish an intense feeling of rapport with the environment, redoubled efforts are now required to overcome this reserve. Thus, in the manner of a vicious circle, the situation goes from bad to worse. The stronger the feeling relation to the object, the more the unconscious opposition comes to the surface. We want to be seen as solid, even though we may not be. And we want to be taken seriously, even though we don't take ourselves seriously because we don't know what our position is. Let's also not forget that Jung's type descriptions and Jung's experience of these types primarily are empirical from the work with his clients. So there is always some psychiatric component to it. He's seen a lot of people with neuroses where the feeling function or any function was overdone, dialed up to 11. The extroverted feeling type suppresses thinking most of all because this is the function most liable to disturb feeling. For the same reason, thinking totally shuts out feeling if it wants to reach any kind of pure results, for nothing is more liable to prejudice and falsify thinking than feeling values. Works both ways. The thinking of the extroverted feeling type is repressed as an independent function. The repression is not complete. It is repressed only so far as the inexorable logic drives it to conclusions that are incompatible with feeling. So we like the logic, but it has to fit underneath the values umbrella. It is suffered to exist as a servant of feeling, or rather as its slave. Its backbone is broken. It may not operate on its own account in accordance with its own laws. Since logic nevertheless exists and its inexorable conclusions must take place somewhere, and it takes place outside consciousness, namely in the unconscious. So that's the anima and animus. Accordingly, the unconscious of this type contains first and foremost a peculiar kind of thinking, a thinking that is infantile, archaic, negative. Whenever we talk about cognitive function, the depth psychology or the analytical psychology approaches look at, well, these are all the things that it does, but what is missing? Because all the things that are missing, all the opposites of the things that this function does and so well, are missing, and that is the unconscious. So extroverted feeling is positive and cheering and complimenting and making sure everyone's happy and agreeing, connecting, harmonizing, keeping the peace. The opposite of that is contrary, challenges, critiquing, objective criteria for decision making, where the values are driving what I think is right and what would be good for society as a whole, or for the community that I'm in, or the family that I'm in. The logic is over here, so the logic is missing, the thinking is missing. And so extroverted feeling types are generally, I would say, optimistic, positive, outgoing, because extroverted. And then the negative quality or the archaic quality comes out in our interior monologue. That inner voice that we have can be very critical indeed, and that comes from the stuff that we are not integrating. Until we integrate the factors of introverted, extroverted thinking, they will pop up in kind of pushy ways until we pay attention to them. So this negative thinking just resonates because it's like, oh yeah, my mind was not a happy place to be many years because I kept getting these, this is wrong, this is bad, you could have done this better, you should have done this differently. So long as the conscious feeling preserves its personal quality, or to put another way, so long as the personality is not swallowed up in successive states of feeling, this unconscious thinking remains compensatory. But as soon as the personality is dissociated and dissolves into a succession of contradictory feeling states, the identity of the ego is lost and the subject lapses into the unconscious. So you can lose yourself into the murky pool of the unconscious. When this happens, it gets associated with the unconscious thinking processes and occasionally helps them to the surface. The stronger the conscious feeling is and the more egoless it becomes, the stronger grows the unconscious opposition. The more energy goes to one function, the less energy there is available for the other. The unconscious thoughts gravitate around just the most valued objects and mercilessly strip them of their value. The nothing but type of thinking comes into its own here, since it effectively depotentiates all feelings that are bound to the object. Okay. Did you get that? Carl is not using simple words. Basically, we then flip into the opposite of everything is fine into either or, black or white. That's how I understand it, and I have examples of that as well. The unconscious thinking reaches the surface in the form of obsessive ideas, which are invariably of a negative and depreciatory character. Like I said, the negative self-talk. Women of this type have moments when the most hideous thoughts fasten on the very objects most valued by their feelings. So I have examples for this as well, where the people who are closest to us, we sometimes feel the most harshly about, and we find ourselves wondering, do we love them or do we hate them? And that can really spiral. This negative thinking utilizes every infantile prejudice or comparison for the deliberate purpose of casting aspersions on the feeling value, and musters every primitive instinct in the attempt to come out with nothing but interpretations. I understand this to mean when we are overwhelmed with the feeling scattered or just not trusting our own evaluations, we get so down on ourselves and reprimand ourselves for not being more logical, and we get really down on the feelings and emotions that we have and the values that we hold. So the primitive instincts to come out with nothing but interpretations, to me, speaks to shoulding all over ourselves. Like, oh, we should be better and they should be better. It need hardly be remarked that this procedure also mobilizes the collective unconscious and activates its store of primordial images, thus bringing with it the possibility of a regeneration of attitude on a different basis. Hysteria, with the characteristic infantile sexuality of its unconscious world of ideas, is a principal form of neurosis in this type. Sounds like he's not loving the extroverted feeling type very much. In fairness, he lays into the advantages and disadvantages and the strengths and weaknesses of all the other cognitive functions as well. The thing that comes to mind is I think he might have been an introverted intuiting type. There is a bit of debate and people can't really agree on, did Carl Jung himself have INTJ or INTP preferences? I think I'm a little more in the INTJ camp just because vibes and, you know, all the things that he brought together. Although that would be a behind the scenes thing. I'm fairly certain he was an introverted thinking type. I don't know if the thinking was more extroverted or more introverted. Either way, for intuiting thinking types, extroverted feeling is pretty low on the totem pole. That's the other kind of caveat that I would like to offer. He's describing extroverted feeling through his own lens, right? He's trying to be objective and basing it on his empirical evidence experiences with extroverted feeling clients and people in his social circles that he met over 10, 20 years. He did this research before he even formulated his theory of personality. So he has a lot of examples he drew on. If we're looking at any research, we have to consider the data pool used to perform the analysis. He was working in psychiatric institutions at the time, and the extroverted feeling types may have been coming to him under stress and with a sense of pathology that he had to help them out of. Having said that, overall, the extroverted feeling type, the way that Jung himself describes them, I resonate with some descriptions. I can find examples for some of his descriptions, and I also want to acknowledge that his experience was of women at a different time and life at a different time. The writing is very dense and very academic and making references to other works that I haven't read, so some of it goes over my head. Okay, I think I'm gonna just leave it here. Psychological Types by Jung, chapter 10, Extroverted Feeling. I've learned some things. I'm gonna have to think about some things. The other books that I'm looking at here that we can go into next will have more up-to-date examples and more descriptions that might be relevant to modern life. So I'm excited to go into those. I hope to see you again, and if you like this video, then you're probably gonna like this next one as well. I'll see you there.